down on prey on we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back again to Eschatology Matters. I'm Josh Howard, and I'm joined today by Derek Cooper, who has a new book publishing through P&R Publishing. So, Derek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Derek, I'm going to let you just give a little bit of introduction. I'm also going to ask you, be sure to plug the book. I think the book just released this week. So just a little bit about yourself and how you've come to the topic of religions, and specifically how we're going to be pushing in a little bit on eschatology.
Yeah, so I'm someone with a lot of interest and a background in a lot of different fields. So I've been a professor. I was a professor for many years, teaching mostly things related to Bible theology, religion, history, languages. And I've written a lot of books on world Christian history. That was one of my topics that I taught a lot of courses on. I also taught Latin and have the Basics of Latin series with Zondervan that I'm excited about, and done a lot of Latin translation projects, including a couple of recent translations of 16th century Reformation authors, and then also Reformation commentary on scripture. So I have a volume on that and another one coming out a little later. And I've also been interested in world religions. I wrote a book a while back called Christianity and World Religions, and this new book, Christianity and New Religious Movements, is the sequel to that. It took a while to get there. So my 9 to 5, essentially, I have a couple of small businesses that I've started. So I run an educational travel company that specializes in learning on locations called Thomas Institute. And that would be the best place for people to learn more about me or get in touch with me. So I take groups all over the world, and most specifically to Bible land. So we work with churches, universities, seminaries, and we take them to lands of the Bible, specifically Israel, Palestine, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Italy, and so on. And I do some other things as well, but those are some of the main things there.
Gotcha. Derek, walk us into the book a little bit, specifically the new one. How does it build on the previous one? I'll let you know, just speaking for a brief moment before we started recording. This is outside my wheelhouse, right? I've taken the world religions class, but this is going to be fun to walk through. How do you come to this new project, and what is it building on?
Yeah, so my interest began many years ago when I was doing a lot of traveling and owning this company where I take groups overseas and going to a lot of Muslim countries and a lot of places where Christianity is not the official religion or even a minor religion in those places. And we really focus on engaging people where they are and in visiting local temples and places of worship, and having conversations, open conversations, just to learn what people believe, why they believe things, how they live their lives. And doing that, just kind of looking at the research available. So when I teach courses, what are the books available? What kind of assignments that I can have people engage? And there's a lot of really great resources out there. A lot of it, though, is really academic. And I guess I would summarize it this way to say, my experience was that there's really kind of two kinds of people who talk about things related to other religions or other faiths. So there's the really academic kind, and those are the kinds of people that I, read when I was doing my PhD. We engage these kinds of authors, and it's nice to know all of the official background and teachings about everything. And then there's the other group that is more apologetic or more defensive, but also not as academic. So they're just kind of talking about these other religions, not in a way that they really have much engagement with them, but just from kind of what they've read from scholars. So what I wanted to do was just kind of bridge the gap, because I remember when I was in seminary, I had a professor, and he always said something basically to the point of, I always want to teach out of my experiences. And for me, I like that, but unlike him, he was what we call a practical theology professor. So he really was teaching on topics like preaching and pastoral care, really important topics. My background was always the more academic stuff. And I thought, I actually want to teach out of my experiences, but I also want to teach out of things that I've learned academically. And so that first book, Christianity and World Religions, was me trying to bring those two together to say, hey, I want to talk about religions, but from a way where, we're engaging real scholarship. On the other hand, that it's based off of real conversation. So no, I've been to these places. I've had conversations with these people, and they're real people. And I want to talk about some of the things that I've learned in a way that maybe, the academic stuff talks very theoretically, but let's also get very practical and engage them. So I did that, and it was world religions. And so generally when we say world religions, we're talking about the major faiths, so the ones that we're familiar with, like Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. But that leaves room for all of these other minor religions that maybe we've heard of before, but they're not as big as the other ones. So it could be something like Baha'i or Nation of Islam or Scientology. And so that's why I'm excited, as we were talking about, the newest book that just came out is the follow-up to that. So this is where we came back after good reception of people enjoyed the style, because the style of that book is more, hey, we're gonna engage these in a friendly way. I'm not going to have a straw man. So, and when I say straw man, a lot of times a lot of people will just they'll say, this is what Mormons believe, and let's show how dumb it is, right? And then they'll just kind of attack it, as opposed to say, well, okay, well, let's talk about what Mormons believe, and then let's try to engage it in a compassionate way. I'm doing so from a confessional standpoint, so I'm happy to say up front, I'm a Christian, and I'm part of this classical, foundation of Christianity, but I can still engage these or other religions without being threatened or without being super defensive.
No, that's really helpful. I'm wondering how, because we've got to shoehorn you into an eschatological conversation on this one, right? This is what we're doing. But no, it's thinking toward new religious movements, and maybe specifically within the United States. I'm wondering how you've seen eschatology sort of come to the forefront of some of those conversations. And just to give you a little background on the question, one of the things I noticed from your writing was you're connecting protology with eschatology a lot of times, creation narratives, as well as kind of that looking toward that end of things or those final things. And that's something we try to do in this channel a lot, is not have a view of eschatology that's truncated or just a couple of chapters of the Bible, but instead look at that whole warp and woof of that narrative. So I wonder what you've seen popping out from some of those studies that you've been doing specifically for this recent book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first of all, good expression, warp and woof. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it. I've read it. It's just such a fantastic phrase. So
yeah, I definitely did not come up with it. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing it. I love it. I totally agree. And so what I do in the world religious books and the new religious movement is I start in the very beginning, as you're talking about, with the origin story. And because for me, my study of all of these different religions, and also of world Christian history, so not just thinking about other religions, but thinking about the full breadth and abundance of Christianity, which is extremely diverse. Mm-hmm. So the beginning absolutely sets the trajectory for what we are going to expect in the end. And when it comes to new religious movements, I should say, because maybe those who are listening might not be familiar with that term, new religious movements, it's somewhat new, but what it really tries to get to is today, scholars don't typically use the word cult or sect anymore. So they're kind of seen as a little outdated or old-fashioned. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but part of the problem with scholarship is people use the word cult and sect in so many different ways. And what we're trying to do is to well, let's really try to actually understand what these different religious traditions believe. And sometimes we can just get so focused on, well, is it a cult or a sect, that we can't get beyond that to see what's really going on. Mm-hmm. It's more complicated than that, but that's the reason why the book is called Christianity, New Religious Movements. So when I refer to them as new religious movements, typically we're talking about religions that have originated or emerged in the last couple of hundred years. So that by nature would not include any of those bigger world religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Confucianism, and Taoism, because those are thousands of years old. But these newer ones are religious traditions that have really moved out of a cult stage or even a sect stage. So they've gone through several generations, and yet they're not necessarily 100 million people, but they're growing. So that's what I'm referring to when I say new religious movements. And to your question about the eschatology, is what's so fascinating about these is another way to think about new religious movements is they're kind of like the great, great, great grandkids of the major world religions. And so every world religion that exists has multiple grandkids or great grandkids, just like, families do. And the DNA has kind of been passed on to them. And for the most part, what I do in the book is I organize new religious movements, some of the most popular ones, because there's thousands of them, but some of the more popular ones into their family systems. And I'll give you an example. So thinking about Christianity, thinking about the two most well-known new religious movements out of Christianity are Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. When it comes to Islam, probably maybe the two most well-known would be Baha'i and Nation of Islam. When it comes to Hinduism, probably the most well-known would be Jainism and Sikhism. So what happens essentially is that if you want to know about the eschatology, so where do these religions end, or these new religious movements end? Well, they take the framework of their parent religion, and they'll make some changes, but for the most part, they keep that overall structure. And I would just kind of put it this way, to put like a fine point on the discussion, is to say, in general, there's really two kinds of ways to look at how world religions see the end times. I should say there's three, really. The one, which is more of an Eastern mentality, is that the world is cyclical in nature. So sure, there might be destruction, but there's just going to be recreation. And so any religion that comes out of Hinduism or Buddhism, any Chinese religion, all of those, Confucianism, Taoism, they're all going to work off of that mentality that we're in cycles, and these cycles go on for eternity. They never end. You have another tradition, which is more Western in orientation, and that does view things more in a linear way. This will include any religion that comes out of Christianity, any religion that comes out of Judaism, any religion that comes out of Islam. So they will look at things like there is a clear beginning and there will be a clear endpoint. There's variations among those. And then the last contender, the third one, is basically also a product of the West, but it's essentially a product of paganism and atheism. In that which case there's nothing. It's just like, there's the Big Bang, and then eventually the sun is going to collapse, in 4.5 billion years. And that's kind of the end. So those are like the three major frameworks. And then what we're looking at now is each new religious movement is going to have different variations of that. So they play around, but that's kind of like the parameter has been drawn for them.
No, that's really interesting. I guess I'm thinking, because I kind of want to ask you two different questions at the same time, but I'm thinking toward kind of the neo-paganism you're referring to, because I think that's really fascinating for a lot of us, is to consider this rise. It's not fascinating in a good way, but it's, it is something to contend with, right? A rise in neo-paganism within Western culture. Yeah. But I'm also thinking back toward the other two. Speak toward neo-paganism first. Let's just do it that way. What have you observed there? And specifically, you mentioned sort of a hopelessness, which I find that fascinating, because as you mentioned at the front end, within Christianity, if you were to ask somebody, what does Christian eschatology look like? How long do you have, right? Like, there's a lot of different takes on that. But just in general, what have you noticed from this kind of neo-pagan kind of uptick within Western culture?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. So I talk about this in the book, where I have two complete sections on this topic. And the way I divide them up is I have pagan new religious movements. So those that come out of paganism. And for a lot of us, we kind of think of like paganism is another one of those terms that people will use it, but they don't really use it in the same way. So scholars have, clear definitions of it, and I talk about that in the book. But I classify probably two of the most well-known pagan new religious movements are Wicca and Scientology. So I have kind of those, and then I also talk about non-committed new religious movements. And I'm specifically thinking about atheism as well as what we call the nuns and the duns. So people who were part of religious traditions, but are no longer officially organized into any one of them. So that's actually one of the fastest growing religious traditions. And it really is a religious tradition because nuns and duns don't necessarily reject religion or spirituality. It's just simply that they're not affiliated in the same way we were historically with these big organizations. So they are kind of working off of somewhat similar backgrounds. But in terms of, paganism, it really comes down to, what they're really ultimately coming from. So, for Wicca, there's kind of a double classification on if we're talking about something that's related to witchcraft, which is an infinitely old religious way of engaging things, or if we're thinking about a specific religion that was created in the 20th century called Wicca. And you see that in the very beginning when Wicca becomes a thing in the middle of the 20th century. There's that debate even then. Are we talking about witchcraft? In which case we're talking about something that's thousands and thousands of years old, or are we talking about something that we just invented, kind of an esoteric secret society kind of thing? And so that will impact how we view the long-term horizon of it. So it's very interesting. And then with paganism, we've got a lot of religions. So heathenism is an actual religion. In Latin America, the rise of the Maya religion, or the resurrection of the Maya religion. And then in the West, in Scandinavia, Western countries, are real going back to this kind of primordial god and goddess worship, which predates Christianity. So it's very interesting how these cultures, these communities are going back into the past, and they're trying to resurrect different things, and they end up in different places though.
Okay. How about the because there's so many questions I want to run down with that one, but
Yeah.
but with the Christian new religions as you're defining them, and I think anybody or new religious movements rather,
Yeah.
and I think anybody that's studied cults can appreciate why you're going with that language, and I get where you're going with that. But with the Christian new religious movements, what have you seen there? Because it seems just from my limited interaction that eschatology does play a rather large role in some of those new religious movements from Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets down to something what I was thinking actually before we were thinking about how diverse Christianity is when it comes to the issue of eschatology. And we could have a variety of different Christians in the room with us, and each one of them could perceive of the end times in a very different way. And that's something that's just going to be magnified when we take it to these new religious traditions. So when it comes to the two that I talked about in the book, which I think are the ones that probably most of us are familiar with, which is Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness. So both of those I classify as they're new religious movements that come out of Christianity. So they absolutely, historically, the parent religion is Christianity, but they've morphed so much out of it that they kind of become their own thing, as opposed to maybe something we were talking about earlier, Seventh-day Adventism, which probably I would still classify as a denomination within Christianity, even though maybe it's one that's a little farther afield than classic Christianity, but more of a denomination as opposed to a new religion. And that, that's something we could go into more detail about. But to your question, the Jehovah's Witness come out of, the same kind of history with the Seventh-day Adventists. That's why I mentioned it. And so this is really going back to something that I think a lot about is basically every theological or religious tradition has a timestamp. And so basically it emerges at a very specific time in history. And when it comes forth, there are certain values that are extremely important then. And those values aren't necessarily important 100 years later or 200 years later. And we could just basically, this is one of the things that I do is thinking about when it comes to Christianity, if we were to classify each denomination, we could put a timestamp and say, these were the issues that were most important or pertinent, urgent for them. and they've continued on. And so in the 1800s, when the Jehovah's Witness emerged in America, and that's important to think about, same thing is true for Mormonism. Both emerged around the same time period in general, right? What's very important is the end time. So there's this huge expectation in the 1800s that the end of the world is coming. And by the way, that idea has always been the case. A book I wrote many years ago called 20 Questions That Shape World Christian History. What I did is for each century, I kind of looked at what's the biggest question of the century that Christians wrestled with, from first all the way to the 20th. And in the 10th century, I isolated the question of, is this the end times? Because it was the millennium, right? So 1,000 years after the birth and the death and resurrection of Christ. So there was a lot of expectation. And the reality is Christians throughout history have had different denominations that really emphasized that this is the time when it's all going to come to an end. And for Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, that was something that was to the forefront, but they took it in different ways. So for the Jehovah's Witnesses, they really went in the direction more of the Adventist direction that they came from, and that is that there's going to be a clear end of days, which has led to, of course, something that maybe we're familiar with. The Jehovah's Witness have been a group that's been very open about attaching the end times to specific dates.
Right. Yeah.
The most well-known probably is 1914, but there were periods in the 1800s, and there have been periods since then. The Mormons don't typically, they're not as specific when it comes to that. And I think there's a variety of reasons. One is that Mormonism is still run by presidents. So there is almost like a Joseph Smith kind of figurehead that still is behind this religion in a way that's not the case for Jehovah's Witness. The other thing for Mormonism is it's important to keep in mind in the early days of Mormonism, Mormonism was actually not founded in America, right? So Utah, for instance, in the mid 1800s, when Mormons were making the trek westward into Utah by people like Brigham Young, after Joseph Smith had died, Utah was not actually the United States. And that's important to realize, that Utah became part of the United States through the direct political interactions between the Mormons, Brigham Young, for instance, and the United States government. So in the early days of Mormonism, prophecies about end times and revelations were very common, and they were widespread, and they were publicized. But there was a lot of tension between them and America, because Mormonism basically was prophesying the end of America. But in the late 1800s, Mormonism wanted to remain in Utah, and the United States was going to make Utah a state. And so they had to play by the rules, the American rules. And so at that time, Mormonism began essentially from the leadership saying, you need to stop talking about end times prophecies like the end of the world and, Jesus is going to come back and destroy America kind of thing, because we need to have a good relationship with the United States. So that led to a shift that took place, whereas Jehovah's Witness did not have that same history.
I wonder what the challenges are. I mean, because you're painting this picture, and we're walking through kind of the Western mindset. Looking back to what you were saying at the beginning, and you were talking about the Western kind of more linear mindset, and specifically with an Eastern mindset. And I'm trying to keep this specifically to the new religions, but I'm also thinking back to some of your previous work, because a lot of what you've done is kind of within the realm, I'd say, of apologetics, or at least interacting with those of different faith streams. How does that work for communicating the gospel to those who are not only looking at eschatology different, obviously the protology too, but the eschatology and the whole sense of the direction of the eschatology? How does that play into a Christian trying to interact specifically in a world where I would say it's far easier to encounter those of different thought patterns and different faith streams in that regard?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is, we as Christians have faced incredible challenges trying to communicate Christianity and understandings of what's coming next in the time to come with religions and people of the East. And it's not difficult to see, because if you look on something like the Geoscheme Nation, so one of my books, it was Introduction to World Christian History. And in there, I basically break down the history of Christianity into geography. And we talk a lot about different global groups, so groups in different parts of the world, and what the percentage of Christianity is there. And I'll just give a couple of examples. So thinking about in Japan, for instance, Christianity is about maybe 1% or so. And that's almost always been the case. Now, when Christianity was early on there in the 1600s, it had a little growth, but things have pushed back. Part of it a lot of it has to do with just this Japanese religious mentality. So Shinto, Buddhism, these kinds of religious traditions that don't have the same linear views of the end. Another example a better example probably would be in India, where the Indian religious tradition is a religious tradition that understands everything in cycles. And so Christianity has had a difficult time there. So even though there's a lot of Christians in India, percentage-wise, it's extremely low. Mm. And the same could be true. We think about China, we think about other religious traditions. So basically, to summarize things, if we kind of divide the world into the East and the West, it's not surprising that Christianity has fared better, at least in terms of there's more members, percentage-wise. Christianity is more represented in the West and far less so in the East. A simplistic way to look at it is, well, sure, because the Western understanding of eschatology, that life is linear, there's a clear beginning, we're here now, and there's going to be a clear end. That system does not compute well in a general Eastern mentality, which views life as cyclical. So there's not a lot of urgency to think about, I have to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior in this life. Like, maybe 100 lives from now, like it'll work itself out. Like, there's in Christianity, particularly for those who are more evangelical tradition within Christianity, is, of course, there's a real urgency behind sharing the faith. And it's not something that we just say, I think we'll just keep it to ourselves and just see what happens. Like, no, there's a responsibility to share with everyone, and thinking about a more Eastern mentality that's just not shared in the same way. So it makes it very challenging.
Yeah. I wonder just within your experience, you've done a lot of this and thought a lot about this. I wonder, within your experience, I know this is kind of like the $1 million question, but like, what are first steps for somebody? What's a way to hone up on that? I know maybe for a lot of people that watch this channel, even this puts feet to eschatology, right? Where we're used to thinking in those terms of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. You're pointing out that's not even the structure of a lot of people's thought across the globe. So how does one go about even engaging that sort of thought process?
It's a great question, and I hate to be a shameless promoter, but I'd say read my 2 books, on world religion and new religious movements, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do now.
Okay, yeah.
To your point, I'm doing it over 150 pages, and breaking it down by religion, where I know a lot of us want a more direct pathway to that. But yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I think a lot about. But I'll just quickly respond, like, kind of the way I frame the book is how I answer the question, because that's how I do it in real life, is thinking about, okay, before I can really have an intelligent conversation with someone, I really need to go back and have an understanding. I'll just give you a quick example. So, I mentioned through Thomas Institute, we take groups overseas. We were overseas all summer, and mostly in the Middle East. And so thinking, I'm in Sultanahmet, I'm in the largest church in Istanbul, Turkey. And in there, it's the mosque was built in the 1600s, same time around Martin Luther's time. A beautiful, large mosque. And we're having conversation with a representative there. And he begins, he is a Muslim apologist. So we're typically thinking about Christian apologists. Well, he's the exact same thing, but different religion. And it was interesting, the interaction we had, because essentially what it came down to is he was taught a very methodical way of how you deconstruct Christianity. but he had no personal engagement with it whatsoever, nor experience, nor had he ever really traveled to a church or had conversations with people. So it became very evident to us that he was mostly working with kind of straw man kind of ideas. So like, you Christians say this, and I'd say, no, we don't. And he didn't know what to do with that because, he was taught, well, this is what Christianity is.
Right.
So, my encouragement to everyone is to, learn a little something about the religious context that you're in, and then have conversations to kind of to vet it out. But when you do, you realize very soon that there are different frameworks, and you have to figure out how to enter that framework. So it's kind of like, thinking we're on a highway or an interstate. You're coming from a neighborhood, and you have smaller roads. That's kind of where we live, in these small roads. But eventually we have to make our way into the interstate. So it's like, we've got to find a way to get there, because that's where the real action takes place, is on these main roads. So we learn and to engage these bigger roads by understanding more about the people and their beliefs, and then having conversations with them. And to me, I've found, and we talk about this in the book, we always have sections on like how do we engage people from these different religious traditions. But to me, it starts with having a better understanding of their religious tradition, so that we know some questions to ask. Because if we're just constantly talking about, like if we have this linear view of the world, and we're talking to people who have a cyclical view, it's like oil and water. We're just like, we can be in the same space together, but we're just not going to be able to have a good penetration of conversation. So understanding that way, and then I find I can find a way to connect to it. So I'll also be looking for, points of contact. That's what we call them in the book, is, always be on the lookout for points of contact. So when you're talking to someone, if you learned about kind of their religious structure or history, you're going to find some point of contact for, the gospel to kind of like, to make a point there, like, yes, we have overlap between those. It's not the same concept exactly, but it's enough for us to move over. And then that's where we can go and just kind of like enter the conversation. And also, I'll give you an example of this too, is when it comes to Islam. So, talking with a lot of Muslims in Muslim countries, Jesus is highly revered within Islam. That's an easy starting point, because, obviously we have different views. We believe Jesus is God as Christians. Muslims believe that Jesus is a great prophet, but they still have high reverence for him. So, okay, that's a point of contact. Now let's engage that further.
No, that's really helpful, and it leads me into what I had to ask you about, which is kind of the eschatology of Islam.
Yeah.
I know that's not exactly within this current book, but you've had previous study and experience in that. But I'm wondering about that, and just maybe specifically just some of your takeaways from it and your study in it, because obviously Islam is a very broad religion. I know Muslim theology and eschatology in general was kind of a hot topic years back. That doesn't seem as prevalent anymore. But what was some of your takeaways on that?
Yeah, so I would say, starting off, thinking of the general framework. So we have these Abrahamic religions. All the Abrahamic religions are linear. And so Islam and Christianity share the same linear understanding of reality. So actually, of all the major religions in the world, and this is something we haven't hit on, but it's kind of related indirectly. There's only two major religions that proselytize or try to convert. So think of every major world religion. There's only two of them that care about converting other people. It's Christianity and Islam. And the reason why is because both of them have the same understanding of, there's a clear beginning, there's a clear point where we are now, and there's going to be a clear judgment at the end. And so it's very important that we fall on the right side. So it's not surprising that of all the religions in the world that Christianity most clashes with, it's always going to be Islam, because we're the only two religions that care about changing people's views, because all the other world religions, they're not built that way, and it doesn't really matter what they believe at the end of the day, because there is no judgment, right? There's no clear endpoint.
Yeah.
So that's a first thing that's really important, I think, to understand about Islam is we can have a direct conversation with Muslims on these topics because we share the same framework. Where the difference is, of course, is where we kind of understand it within that, but the framework is the same. And when it comes to Islam, another kind of interesting thing that people may not realize is that Jesus will come back. That's the belief within Islam. So this is something that maybe Christians are surprised to hear about, because they would think, well, if any prophet would come back, it would be Muhammad, right? No, Muhammad does not come back. Jesus is the one who comes back to judge. And so the irony is, from Christians, we look at Jesus as God and we worship Jesus. But so it's just kind of interesting to think about from a Muslim standpoint, they're saying that we're going to be judged by Jesus to be in the wrong. And we think, well, we're the ones worshiping him. Like, surely you don't even worship him. We worship him. Surely we're in the right. So that's one thing. Typically, within Islam, there's two major traditions. There's Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Shia Islam is much more apocalyptic and messianic. And so this is based off of the idea that there is going to be, there's a literal descendant of Muhammad, and it's called Al-Mahdi. This actually ties into Baha'i, which is one of the religions that I cover in the new book, because Baha'i comes directly out of Shia Islam. So it has all of that history there, and they absolutely see Jesus coming back and offering judgment. In Sunni Islam, he does as well, but it's kind of done differently. But at the end of the day, of course, according to Islam, even though Jesus comes back to judge between the good and the evil, the good are those that did not worship Jesus and alone were submissive to Allah, understanding that Muhammad was the final prophet who went beyond Jesus, as opposed to, of course, Christianity. We believe we worship Jesus and we're going to be rewarded for that. We're primed well to engage Islam on issues of eschatology because we share the same general eschatology. Of course, the details are different, but I'm talking about the main framework. We share that with them. So that makes it really easy, where we actually don't have to translate much. The point of contact is right in front of us, in other words, as opposed to if we're talking about people who come from a Taoist or Confucianist or Buddhist or Hindu kind of mentality, their framework is so different from ours that it seems the point of contact, we've got to go really long under the tunnel, in the tunnel under the sea before we can actually then get to where we want to go. Whereas with Islam, we can just go directly there because we share that same understanding.
Right. So you're disagreeing on like what the end of the road looks like, but at least you're on the same road, and you're describing that other thought process as like you're on a completely different road. That's helpful.
Yeah, and then it just comes down to it's the details, right? Obviously, details matter, but the framework has already been put together, and neither religious tradition can change that, right? So there's a clear beginning, there's a clear point where we are now, and there's going to be a clear end. So we don't have the ability to influence that, but we can influence the specific things from now until the end.
Gotcha. Okay. Any final takeaways, Derek, from the book? Obviously, the book is out. It's out right now. Is that going to be correct? It'll be out by the time this airs in any case.
Yeah. Christianity, New Religious Movements is out and available anywhere you buy books.
Is this, and by the way, I forgot to ask at the beginning, is this like obviously you can use this as a textbook. Is this going to be something that the layperson can jump in on?
Yeah. So for me, it's always important to try to, it's a different audience, but we think about people who want to engage these topics, who are not scholars, so not people who necessarily are, in graduate studies. At the same time, it can work well. So it could work well, any classroom kind of setting, it would work really well. And any kind of church context, small group or Sunday school class, or just someone who wants to learn more, because the reality is there's not a lot of resources out there of people who are Christians and who have frameworks for things, but are trying to put kind of the language together in a more user-friendly way to talk about Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or Scientology or Baha'i. So as I was talking about earlier, there's like the really scholarly way, and then there's the really kind of very, very, very layperson kind of way. So trying to be in between those two.
Right. No, I'm very sympathetic to the aim of wanting to understand where your neighbor is coming from so you can engage them. That's a commendable avenue. So anyway, Derek Cooper, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Josh. I appreciate it.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command.